There are whispers in the Sahel that no one dares to record. Not because they are untrue, but because they are too true, and too dangerous for those who built the old order. Last week, William Stevens, the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, stood in Bamako and declared, "We have the strongest military in the world." But the men who heard him did not flinch. They had seen what strength means, not in suits and briefcases, but in trenches and sacrifice. And they had already decided. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, 3 nations once on their knees, now walk shoulder to shoulder. Not behind anyone, but toward a future no outsider can map. When the West came offering help, the reply was silent, yet deafening. This is not 1960. This is not a continent waiting for permission. This is not a people begging for aid. If this story matters to you, if you believe Africa has the right to rise on its own terms, like this video, leave your voice in the comments. And subscribe. The real power now lies in the ones who refuse to kneel. On July 21, William Stevens, the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, arrived in Mali. He came with protocol, power, and promises. In a press statement delivered with gravity, he declared, "We have the strongest military in the world. We produce the most advanced weapons. And Mali is important to us." He said the same in Niger. And again in Burkina Faso. But behind the nods, behind the polite diplomacy, the message was received coldly. Because in Jibo, in Gao, in Niamey, the people are not waiting anymore. They are building. They are arming. They are remembering who they are. And that, more than any foreign visit, is what frightens empires. He who builds the road chooses where the world will go. That's not just a proverb in the Sahel anymore, it is now the most dangerous truth in geopolitics. Because in Li Jibo, northern Burkina Faso, something unthinkable has happened. The dust no longer chokes the roads. Asphalt now stretches across what was once an abyss of terror. Farms have reopened. Markets breathe again. Life is returning. 3 years ago, you couldn't even whisper the word Jibo without invoking fear. It was a dead zone. A red dot on every intelligence map. Today, it's a starting line. The story of Jibo is not a miracle, it is a statement. A statement from a people who chose to stop bowing. And across Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, similar stories are emerging, not told by Western journalists, but carved by workers in boots, soldiers in mud, and leaders who've tasted betrayal enough to trust only their own. In Mali, return flights now land daily with exiled citizens, engineers, investors, even teachers, responding to a government promise that their capital will be safe, respected, and protected. This isn't a dream. It's a blueprint. And in Niger, tracks for freight trains are being laid across valleys that, just a year ago, were patrolled by drones and silence. A nation that once exported raw ore now speaks openly about industrial zones. A country once pitted for uranium is now designing its energy sovereignty. This is what scares the world's old architects. Because the AES alliance, born in backlash, baptized in blood, is now building. And when Africans start building without asking permission, the satellites start blinking red. They're not just resisting anymore. They're replacing. But none of this happened in isolation. It came through sacrifice. The kind that doesn't make the headlines. Like in the brigades of Burkina Faso's northern front, where young men carry weapons older than them. And sleep under tarps on ground they refuse to cede. And at the center of these stories is not a speech. It's a man. Captain Watau. Or rather, Lieutenant Colonel Watau. The terror of terrorists. The ghost who never lost a battle. A man no one saw, until now. When the world finally glimpsed him, he wasn't what they expected. Not a towering figure. Not a scarred warlord. He was barely 30. Clean-shaven. Calm. But in his eyes, fire. This man, with 72 days on the front line at Li Jibo, became legend not because he boasted, but because every inch of land he stood on. He never gave back. He led the 72 immortals of the Rapid Intervention Brigade. A name that once sounded like myth, now etched into the fears of every jihadist cell from Timbuktu to Lake Chad. And when he was promoted, it wasn't just a rank. It was an omen. Because if Burkina Faso can produce men like him, young, disciplined, fearless, what else can it produce without foreign support? What happens when a continent stops exporting heroes and starts building with them? That's the question no envoy, no drone strike, no press release can suppress. And maybe that's why William Stevens' words, though wrapped in diplomacy, fell with a thud. Because while he spoke of advanced weapons and strongest military, AES had already built something stronger. A reason to believe. A reason to stay. A reason to defend what is theirs. For the first time in decades, Africans are not simply reacting. They are initiating. And it terrifies the very powers that once carved borders here with rulers and rifles. Because what happens when Mali paves its own roads, and no longer needs IMF loans to do it? What happens when Niger builds trains not for French uranium, but for its own people? What happens when Burkina Faso declares it will never again export raw gold without setting its own prices? It's not terrorism they fear. It's sovereignty. The kind that grows slowly. Steadily. Unapologetically. And it's happening, now. So when the American envoy looked into the eyes of the Sahel's leaders and said, "We are in the best position to fight terrorism in Mali," the silence in that room said everything. Because AES doesn't need another fight. It's already winning the war of definition. The battle to say, this is who we are, and this time. No one else decides. If this vision stirs something in you, if the rise of Africa means more than just headlines, leave your voice in the comments. Not because we seek validation, but because stories of freedom only live if they're carried. And if they're heard. In the heart of the Sahel, where maps once faded into red zones and silence, there is a story now whispered with reverence, not because it is secret, but because it is sacred. It begins in Li Jibo, a place once written off by foreign advisors as irrecoverable, hostile terrain, and permanently lost. A region where even satellites dared not linger long. Where French outposts withdrew, and where American drones buzzed without purpose. That was before 72 men walked in. Not with NATO gear. Not under foreign command. But under the quiet leadership of a man nobody had ever seen, yet whose name was already myth. Watau. No medals. No press releases. No interviews. Only results. For 72 days straight, in the dust storms and gunfire of Li Jibo, this man, no older than 30, led an operation that didn't just repel enemies. It redefined the meaning of the word security. They called his unit the 72 Immortals. Not because they were invincible, but because none of them, not one, had fallen in battle. In modern warfare, that is unheard of. And in the Sahel, it is miraculous. Watau's name became more than a rank. It became a shadow in the minds of insurgents. His movement patterns were studied like scripture. Terror cells changed their routes to avoid any sector where he was rumored to operate. But the most remarkable thing wasn't his tactics. It was his refusal to abandon the front line. While foreign advisors hid behind blast-proof walls in capital hotels, Watau slept in trenches with his men. He ate from the same tins, marched the same paths, and bled, not beside them, but ahead of them. That's what command means here. It's not conferred by politics. It's earned, inch by inch, kilometer by kilometer, life by life. And so, when news came that Captain Watau had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, there was no parade, no ceremony. Just a quiet understanding across the Sahel. The war had entered a new phase. Because if this young man, born in a region once ruled by warlords and silence, could rewrite the rules of engagement without a single Western consultant, what else could the AES rewrite? And that, more than missiles, more than gold, more than uranium, is what scared Washington. Because in the logic of empire, there are formulas. They expect resistance to come with desperation. They expect negotiation to come with fear. And they expect leadership to look like them, tall, polished, English-speaking, and eager for aid. But Watau shattered all of it. His French was rough. His boots were worn. His smile was brief. And his victories were undeniable. He didn't ask for support. He didn't wait for approval. He acted. And now, from Li Jibo to the fringes of Gao, new units are forming in his image. Not because they were ordered, but because they were inspired. Across AES, military academies are no longer quoting foreign doctrines. They're studying Watau's campaigns. Young recruits do not dream of training in Fort Benning or St. Cyr, they want to fight in Watau's brigade. This is not just nationalism. It's not even just pride. It's a return to something deeper, the African military tradition that existed long before anyone sailed in from the West. The kind of leadership that binds through sweat, not salary. That teaches by marching, not lecturing. That protects with conviction, not contracts. And this reawakening is not limited to Burkina Faso. In Mali, combat doctrine is shifting. No longer are operations solely reactive to intelligence from overseas agencies. Instead, local informants, tribal elders, and veterans of village militias are being brought into strategic planning, and it's working. In Niger, drone surveillance is being redirected from Western pipelines to actual civilian threat zones. Soldiers are not standing guard over uranium mines owned by France, they are protecting farmers who returned after a decade of exile. This is not counterinsurgency. This is counter-imperial defense. The battlefield has changed, not in terrain, but in meaning. The fight is no longer just against terrorists. It is against the very idea that Africans must always be dependent to be secure. And that's why the image of Lieutenant Colonel Watau matters so much. Because for every photo op of a foreign advisor with a Sahel minister, there is now a grainy, dust-covered photo of Watau leading his men across a ridgeline. Because for every $1 million aid package with 14 conditions, there is a kilometer of road secured by men who didn't wait for approval to act. Because for every declaration from Washington about fighting terrorism, there is now living proof in the Sahel of how it's actually done. Not with speeches, but with sacrifice. Not with strategy papers, but with sons of the soil. So yes, the West may still believe it has the strongest military. But strength is not volume. Strength is not steel. Strength is not GDP. Strength is choosing to stay when everything says run. And that is what the AES, and men like Watau, have done. They stayed. They fought. They built. And now, they lead. If this battle speaks to your heart, if you believe the world must know who the real heroes are, share this story, comment your thoughts, and subscribe. Let the algorithms carry what the newspapers won't. Because the legacy of freedom depends on how far the truth can travel. When outsiders think of the Sahel, they imagine a wasteland. A strip of land stretching across Africa, too dry to cultivate, too unstable to govern, too far gone to rebuild. But that image is no longer real. Not in Wahiguya, where solar grids now power irrigation systems. Not in Tilaberi, where concrete mixers hum louder than gunfire. Not in Mopti, where farmers ride past craters that have become gardens. Because in the shadows of war, AES has begun to build. Not under the banner of any NGO. Not through the blueprints of World Bank consultants. But from the ground up, with their own hands, their own budgets, and their own ideas of what sovereignty should look like. The West came offering development. But it always came with strings. Loans with interest. Aid with lectures. Infrastructure with naming rights. AES said, no more. So they began with roads, the arteries of independence. In Burkina Faso alone, over 300 kilometers of newly paved roads have been laid in previously red zones. These were not ceremonial boulevards for politicians. They were lifelines, connecting villages, markets, hospitals, and, critically, troop routes. In Niger, entire regions that were once no-go zones are now mapped not by drone coordinates, but by construction markers. Bridges are being built across rivers that had long separated people from safety and commerce. In Mali, cities once dim after sunset now glow with solar streetlights, sourced, installed, and maintained by local engineers trained not abroad, but in AES-backed technical schools. This is not aid. This is autonomy. And it's just beginning. Industrial zones are emerging where refugee camps used to stand. In one such zone outside Ouagadougou, a factory now produces electrical transformers. In another, in Dasso, Niger, the nation's first domestically owned fertilizer plant has opened. slashing dependency on imports and powering the continent's march toward agricultural sovereignty. These aren't Western-funded initiatives. They are state-backed, people-owned, and security-protected. Which leads to a deeper truth. AES doesn't just build. It guards what it builds. Every kilometer of road is patrolled. Every construction site has a perimeter plan. Every school reopened in the north comes with a village defense unit trained by the army. Why? Because AES has learned the lesson written in blood across Africa. What you build, they will try to burn. So the Sahel has adapted. Not by inviting more UN peacekeepers, but by forming an ecosystem of resilience, engineers, farmers, builders, soldiers, all working in tandem, not competition. And perhaps the most powerful symbol of this new model: the military academies. Gone are the days when top officers had to be trained in France, Britain, or the US. In Bamako and Niamey, AES-backed academies now teach not just tactics, but philosophy of sovereignty, unity, and African military thought. The curriculum. It includes the campaigns of Ibrahim Traoré, the wisdom of Thomas Sankara, and now, the field strategies of Lieutenant Colonel Watau. Cadets no longer dream of dining with foreign attaches. They dream of commanding operations that protect their own communities. And what about language? For decades, military education in West Africa was bound by colonial tongues. Today, lectures are being given in Fulfulde, Bambara, and Hausa. Because freedom begins with voice, and voice begins with mother tongue. But the transformation doesn't end with boots and textbooks. Diplomatically, AES has redrawn the rules. There are no more private meetings with foreign diplomats. There is a decree: if you want to speak with one member of the alliance, you speak with all three. This is unprecedented in modern African politics. It's no longer Mali negotiating for Mali. It's AES speaking with one voice, in unison, with clarity, and without fear. This shift has rattled embassies across the region. Where once there was division, the kind easily exploited, now there is unity. Where once there were client states, now, co-builders. And for every dollar withdrawn by Western donors, AES has responded not with panic, but with policy. Cut. Build your own. Blocked. Trade with new partners. Threatened. Train harder. The resilience is real. Because the will is real. AES isn't just surviving post-coup sanctions, media slander, and diplomatic isolation, it is thriving. Its population, especially the youth, are seeing, some for the first time, what it means to grow up under leaders who look them in the eye and say, "We owe no one." This is not anti-West. It's post-West. A rejection not of friendship, but of domination. Not of cooperation, but of conditionality. Because if the West truly respected AES, they would offer partnership, not patronage. They would listen, not lecture. They would support, not supervise. But until that day comes, AES walks forward. Sometimes alone. Often misunderstood. But always upright. And that image, of a continent that builds without begging, that is what terrifies the old order. If this story reminds you that power doesn't come from permission, share it. Comment your vision for a free Africa. Subscribe to hear more stories the world won't tell. Let the algorithm do what the old empires couldn't. Spread the truth. William Stevens did not come to Mali to observe. He came to remind. To remind the Sahel that the United States is still watching. Still present. Still, in control. But he came too late. By the time he landed in Bamako, the ground had already shifted. Roads had been paved without his country's asphalt. Terror cells had been dismantled without his country's drones. And leaders had made decisions, without his country's permission. So he did what diplomats do when leverage is gone. He spoke loudly. We have the strongest military in the world. We produce the most advanced weapons. Mali is important to us. But no one asked him that. No one in Mali said, "Please protect us." No one in Niger requested precision air support. No one in Burkina Faso begged for bases or advisors. Because Mali already has a security partner, Russia. Because Niger is building its own intelligence infrastructure. Because Burkina Faso has Lieutenant Colonel Watau. And none of these partnerships came with strings, sanctions, or sermons. So why the visit? Why now? Because behind the polished smile and open hands was an unspoken truth. The West is losing grip. Not just militarily, but psychologically. They used to be feared. Now, they are being ignored. And that is worse. Mali, they say, is important. But what they mean is Mali is rich. In gold. In lithium. In location. Niger. The world's 7th largest uranium producer, and now unwilling to sell it at dictated prices. Burkina Faso. Home to untapped rare earths and mines that no longer accept foreign curriculum without questioning its purpose. So Stevens arrived. Not to negotiate, but to reassert relevance. To remind AES that power still flows from Washington. But what he found was 3 nations that had already rerouted their futures. 3 nations that now speak in one voice. 3 nations that no longer see American presence as assurance, but as interference. They listened, yes. They nodded, yes. But they did not budge. Because AES doesn't need proof of what U.S. presence brings. They've seen it in Nigeria, where American weapons flow, but so does chaos. They've seen it in Afghanistan, where America built, bombed, and abandoned. They've seen it in Libya, where liberation brought slavery. So when Stevens said, "We're best positioned to fight terrorism in Mali," the silence in the room wasn't awkward. It was intentional. It was the silence of men who had learned. He who brings the match does not always come to bring light. So they let him speak. And when he left, they returned to their work. Paving roads, guarding schools, mining with dignity. Not because they reject America, but because they no longer need it. And perhaps, that is the loudest statement of all. They came to remind us who we were. But we already remembered. In the trenches of Li Jibo. On the rails of Niamey. In the classrooms of Bamako. In the silence that met a foreign envoy's speech. We are no longer asking. We are no longer waiting. We are building. And for the first time in generations, the world is watching not because we begged, but because we dared. Dared to define safety in our own terms. Dared to plant hope in our own soil. Dared to rise, without instructions. So let them come. Let them speak. We will listen. But we will not bow. Because this is our time, and our voice is not borrowed. If this story lit something in you, like this video, leave your mark in the comments, and subscribe. And more than that. Speak. Share. Teach. Because the fire they tried to extinguish is now a flame that spreads. And it is ours to guard.